high side, Murphy shooting, save a rebound on the view.
Hey everyone, this is Casey. You're watching the Red Rubber Duckman All Sports Network, and it's finally here. Part 3 of my What If series on what if the pandemic never happened? What if the 2020 NCAA men's basketball tournament was allowed to proceed as followed? And it's, let's just say, simulating this whole tournament has been chaotic, to say the least. With the conference tournaments, we had a few bid stealers. It was very difficult trying to get the bracket together following the selection committee rules. And it was just as chaotic because it took me a very, very long time to simulate the whole thing with streams and other real life stuff. And it was very difficult to try to get this on track. But without further ado, let's not waste any more time. Let's go over the 2020 NCAA men's basketball tournament according to this simulation. To simulate the whole tournament, I used What If Sports. You may recognize it from the What If the college football playoffs was a pyramid scheme. And so, took that same website, and I went ahead and simulated the whole tournament. Also used it for the conference tournaments. So, without further ado, let's get to the results. We're going to start with the first 4 games that would have been played on Tuesday night, March 17th in Dayton, Ohio. And the first of the first 4 games will be Robert Morris and Prairie View A&M. And it would be the Panthers beating the Colonials 83-80. A very close game with the largest lead in the first half being 7, and it would remain close, and the Colonials would have a chance to tie the game from 3, and it would not go. And that would give Prairie View A&M a date with Baylor in the first round. Next up, we have NC State and Texas. This is one of your last 4 in games, and the first half was close, but then the Wolfpack began to run away with it in the second half, and they would win 82-70, and NC State would be put in a showdown against Michigan. We now move on to March 18th, Wednesday night games for the first 4. And we have our 16-seeded matchup between Grand Canyon and Morgan State. The Antelopes jumped into the lead late in the first half, and they never looked back as they beat the Bears 72-59. Grand Canyon would go up against the top-seeded Kansas. To conclude the first 4, we have Texas Tech, last year's runner-up, and Wichita State. Both teams would jump out to double-digit leads, but Texas Tech would make the last jump, and they would move on by a score of 91-79. And Texas Tech will be going on to face another fellow Final Four participant from last year in Auburn. With the first 4 now complete, we can now move on to the actual NCAA tournament field. At this point, all of the brackets that people would have filled out would be locked in, and we get our first batch of upsets, and of course, mostly favorites winning here in this tournament. But the first game to kick off this whole 63-game ordeal will be Utah State versus Iowa over in the Midwest region, and Utah State would take care of business 81-72. The first half would see neither team jump out to a double-digit lead, and then the Aggies would start to pull away, and they would hold on. We now fly on over to the South region, where we have pretty much our first close shave of the tournament, and it involves Villanova and Georgia Southern. Now, if you're wondering how any of these teams made it into the NCAA tournament, I would highly suggest you watch parts 1 and 2 before going on. That way you have an idea of where these teams came from. Now, Georgia Southern would keep Villanova close throughout the whole game. The Wildcats would have a 6-point lead with under 2 minutes left, the Eagles would cut it down to 1. Unfortunately, Ike Smith would miss the go-ahead jumper in the final seconds, and Colin Gillespie would hold on to the rebound, and Villanova would survive Georgia Southern. Now on to the East region with West Virginia taking on Liberty. West Virginia, no trouble here, 89-63. It started close, but once the Mountaineers got hot, the Flames just could not keep up. It's now back to the Midwest region with our 4th seed Wisconsin Badgers taking on the 13th seeded Summit League champions North Dakota State Bison. Now the Bison got hot in the first half, jumping out to a 15-point lead at halftime. The Badgers would try to battle back from being down by as much as 23. They would bring it down to 3, but they ran out of time, and it was simply too little, too late, as North Dakota State pulls off the first upset of this NCAA tournament. And now we stay in the Midwest region with Creighton and Portland State. While the Blue Jays never really pulled away from the Vikings, they did keep the pace. They never looked back, as the Blue Jays would move on 76-67, and they will take on Utah State in the second round. It's now back to the South region with Illinois and Arizona State. Both of these teams got hot and cold at times, but the Sun Devils would get hot at the right time, the perfect time, and big time. And they would contain the Fighting Illini in the second half. They would win 84-70. Arizona State sets up a date with Villanova. And now back to the East with Kentucky and Vermont. Now both of these teams would have a tight first half, but once the score was 53-all, it would all become undone for the Wildcats, and the Catamounts would go on a 21-2 run to end the game. Final score 80-61. Vermont with their biggest tournament win in program history. Vermont would go on to face West Virginia. Back to the Midwest region with BYU and Stephen F. Austin. This is your 12-5 game. Now this was a tale of two halves. Stephen F. Austin took over the first half, jumping out to a 15-point lead at the break. And all of a sudden, here come the Cougars as they would get white hot in the second half, and they would advance 84-65. BYU will take on North Dakota State. Now we're back to the South region with St. Mary's and USC. This is your 8-9 matchup. Now, there were no double-digit leads throughout the whole game as both teams fought hard, but in the end, it was the Trojans that did just enough to move on 75-70. And now it's over back to the East region with Seton Hall and Hofstra. Now, the Pride did give the Pirates a good fight throughout the first half, but Seton Hall would eventually run away with it and prove to be too much for Hofstra. The Pirates move on by a score of 83-76. Back to the South as we have Penn State and Cincinnati up next. This was yet another tale of two halves, with Cincinnati taking care of the first half, and Penn State would go white hot in the other half and eliminate the Bearcats by a score of 91-81. And now we have the top seed in the West with Gonzaga taking on FIU. Gonzaga would dominate the first and the second halves, so not much to see here. Gonzaga wins 87-59. Poor Panthers. Why did I have to pit them with Gonzaga? And now a rather sketchy 1-16 matchup in the South region with Baylor and Prairie View A&M. Both of these teams went cold in the first half, with the Panthers having the halftime lead. Prairie View A&M would be able to hold on to it until the last 2 minutes when Mikal Teague hits the go-ahead three, and Baylor would then hold on to survive 68-63, and they will have a showdown with USC in the next round. Back to the East region we go. We have Michigan taking on NC State. Now the Wolfpack would get a hair hotter in both halves, including a 10-point halftime lead. And the Wolverines, try as they might, they couldn't fight back as NC State goes from first four to the second round, 84-69. They will take on Seton Hall.
And now, for the next few minutes, as the Doak Birds.
If you've ever heard of the YouTube channel Red5478, you would understand that the 2024 Florida State Seminoles men's football team made his life a living hell. Not only were they so terrible that they deserved videos week after week, but they prevented him from continuing his national championship series. However, he managed to get them both done, and yet he still doesn't know the origins of this terrible phenomenon. Unbeknownst to him, it's just an entire Florida State curse. They do win championships from time to time, but it just feels like they could have done more. But except they choked. One such example would have been the 2020 Florida State men's basketball team. They were riding high into the NCAA tournament with a regular season championship in the Atlantic Coast Conference. They may have been knocked down in the semifinals against Duke, but they still earned a respectable number 3 seed. For their game in Tampa, they drew the Winthrop Eagles, the Big South juggernaut. So far, it's been a reoccurring theme of close games in this NCAA tournament simulation. Florida State would end up escaping the first half with a 3-point lead, but neither team would pull ahead clearly. However, in the final minute, the Eagles would go on an 8-0 run, preventing Florida State from going any further into the NCAA tournament. Thus, another Florida State season full of promise ends prematurely, as Winthrop will go on to take on Penn State. Why the hell did I steal this series from Red? Because As the Duke burns is eternal, and you will soon find out, maybe in September, as the Duke burns. But seriously, go ahead and check out Red's channel. I'll put a link to his channel in the description below. Now let's get to the tournament before I get frickin' stuttered again. To cap off a tremendous Thursday of games, we have LSU and Colorado as your 8-9 matchup in the West. The Tigers got hot in the first half and would continue to hold. The Buffaloes were cold for a full 40 minutes, and they couldn't climb their way back as LSU earns a date with Gonzaga. We now move on to Friday games for this NCAA tournament, and we have Providence and Rutgers in the East region. Yet another close first half. In fact, it ended even at 43 apiece, but eventually the Friars were able to hold the Scarlet Knights to only one basket in the last 4 minutes. They win it 82-72, and they move on. Let's stay in the East with Houston and East Tennessee State. This is your 7-10 matchup. It was another tight battle with Houston pulling away slightly in the first half, but the Buccaneers were able to claw back and make this a game. The Cougars, however, were able to hold East Tennessee State to only one bucket in the last 6 minutes. They're going to move on by a score of 76-66. Let's move up to the Midwest region with Marquette in Florida, your 8-9 matchup. Marquette began to jump in the first half, but the Gators were keeping it close. However, 8 minutes without points was Florida's downfall, as the Golden Eagles would capitalize. They win by yet another 10-point margin, 79-69. Nice. Next up, we go to the West with San Diego State and UC Santa Barbara. Note to self, do not piss off the 2020 San Diego State Aztecs men's basketball team. Everyone in their path might be destroyed, and UC Santa Barbara were the latest victims, 86-66. We now go to the 1-16 matchup in the East with Dayton taking on Boston University. Now, there were alarm bells early for an upset, with the Terriers up by as much as 9 in the first half. However, the Flyers would regain control and claw their way to a win and survive a 16-1 bid by a score of 83-74. They will be taking on Providence. Now, are you guys ready for a true tournament shocker? It involves our 2-15 matchup in the East, Duke and Siena. Now, it didn't seem like Duke was in trouble at first, as they ended the first half with the lead, but the Saints would claw back from down by as much as 12. And 8 years after losing to 15-seeded Lehigh in Greensboro, the Blue Devils would lose to another 15 seed in the same building. 88-84 is the final. Siena will go on to take on Houston. Oh, Duke, why are you? Now we have our overall number 1 seed, Kansas, taking on Grand Canyon. I did say Kansas was the overall number 1 seed, and they showed it here. There's not really much that needs to be said. The Jayhawks move on by a score of 82-56. Next up, we got another 7-10 matchup in Arizona and Oklahoma. Now, both teams would start the game cold, but the Wildcats would start to get hot, and they would be able to hold off the Sooners in the second half. Arizona will move on by a score of 73-64. You thought the chaos was done? It just continues in Cleveland with Michigan State and Northern Kentucky, your 3-14 matchup in the Midwest. The Norse went into Cleveland and made a statement early, and they contained the Spartans the whole game, and yet another 3 seed will go down 75-60. Next up, we have Louisville and Akron over in the South region. The Zips were able to lock down the Cardinals in the first half. However, Louisville was able to lock in and claw their way back and avoid yet another upset. The Cardinals move on 87-78. Next, we now go to the West with Maryland and Bradley. The first half saw both teams go on a series of double-digit runs, and it would end in an 8-point Maryland lead. The Terrapins would continue to hold the momentum and hold off the Braves 79-70. Next up, we have Butler and Alabama. The Crimson Tide would go up by as much as 10 in the first half, but the Bulldogs would tie it right at halftime. And Butler would go in front and would never look back and hold off Alabama to move on to the second round by a score of 82-74. Next up, we have the reigning, defending, undisputed national champions in the Virginia Cavaliers taking on the Richmond Spiders in a 6-11 matchup. Both teams would go on little runs, and the first half would end with a 4-point Spiders lead. The runs would continue to go back and forth, but Richmond would take the lead with 39 seconds left and would hold on to knock out the defending champions, and Richmond sets up a double-digit matchup with Northern Kentucky, ensuring a double-digit seed in the Sweet 16. Next up, we have the South region with Ohio State and Yale as your 5-12 matchup. This one was a true tale of two halves. The Buckeyes would take care of business in the first half, going off to a 14-point lead, and they would go to the locker room up 9. But it all came undone as the Bulldogs got hot, and they would eliminate Ohio State 80-71 in a classic 12-5 upset. Next up, we have a battle between two Final Four teams from 2019, and it's Auburn and Texas Tech, your 6-11 matchup over in the West region. And it would see Auburn get white hot in the first half, and the Tigers would continue to be hot on their way to the second round as they eliminate the Red Raiders 91-77. Your final matchup in the first round consists of Oregon and Belmont, your 4-13 matchup in the West. Oregon kept their foot on the gas the whole game, and they never really gave the Bruins an opportunity to get into the game. The Ducks would move on 77-55. We now go to second round games that would have been played on Saturday, March 21st, 2020. And we have Utah State and Creighton. This is your 2-10 matchup in the Midwest. Both teams would have a productive first half with the Aggies holding a slight advantage. Utah State did try their best to hold on to the lead, but the Blue Jays would eventually nose ahead, and they would be the first team to go on to the Sweet 16. Next up, you have the Baylor Bears and the USC Trojans in a matchup between the 1 seed and 9 seed in the South. The Trojans and the Bears would have a close first half, and the Baylor Bears would hold on and keep their run going to Houston for the Sweet 16 on their way to the South Region semifinals. Next up, we have Villanova and Arizona State. We're going to stay in the South Region. This game was a dogfight from the word go. The largest lead was only 6, and it would come down to shooting. In that category, the Sun Devils were a hair better, and another favorite would go home early as the Wildcats get sent packing out of the NCAA tournament, and the 10th seed will move on to the Sweet 16. Next up, we have West Virginia and Vermont, and the Catamounts show that they are here to make noise. They would be up by as much as 9 and take a 2-point lead with them to the locker room. And Vermont would hold, and they would be the latest tournament surprise as the Catamounts move on to the Sweet 16 for the first time in program history. Next up in the Midwest, we have BYU and North Dakota State. Both teams started slow, but BYU would pick it up, and they would have an 8-point lead at halftime. The Bison would claw their way back, but BYU would be up 2, and North Dakota State had 16 seconds to lead or tie, but the Cougars would end up surviving 70-68 and would move on to the Sweet 16. Next up is Seton Hall and NC State. This one was a tale of two halves, with the Wolfpack fighting off the Pirates and leading at halftime by 5. However, Seton Hall would come back from the break swinging, and they would punch their ticket to the Sweet 16 by a score of 91-83. Next up is a rather interesting matchup, Penn State and Winthrop. Now, both teams went cold for stretches of time in the first half, and the Eagles would head into the break up by 2. But the Nittany Lions would roar back and fend off a Winthrop rally, and they would go on to the Sweet 16 to take on Arizona State. Your final Saturday matchup would be between Gonzaga and LSU. It was the Tigers that started off on a 10-1 run. However, the Bulldogs calmed down, and they would take control and win it 90-72 and go all the way to the Sweet 16. To tip off the Sunday games, we got number 1 Dayton taking on number 8 Providence over in the East region. The first half was very close for most of it, but the Friars would have a little run and the halftime lead. They would be up by as much as 15, but the Flyers would claw back and have the lead with 2 seconds left. However, Dwayne Cohill misses a 1-and-1. The Flyers would call timeout, and the ball was inbounded from half court, and Wayne Pipkins would hit the buzzer-beaten 3 to send Dayton to an early exit and Providence to the Sweet 16. Hope you guys like double-digit seeds because we got 2 of them here with Richmond and Northern Kentucky. The Spiders will remain hot throughout the first half and then the second half. The Norse never really had a chance as Richmond would go on to the Sweet 16 and they would take on Creighton. Next up is Houston and Siena, your 7-15 matchup in the East region. Yet another tale of two halves with this game. Houston would take care of the first half and head to the break with a 10-point lead. However, the surprising Saints would roar back and become the 4th double-digit seed into the Sweet 16, and it would begin a long string of teams listed as the 15th seed to move on to either the Sweet 16 or further. Now it's time to see the overall number 1 seed in action as Kansas takes on Marquette. It took the Jayhawks a bit of time to heat up, but they would find themselves up 12 at the half, and they would continue the onslaught and lead by as much as 20. The Marquette rally wouldn't matter as Kansas would win 72-63, and the overall number 1 seed is on to the Sweet 16 to take on BYU. Next up, we have San Diego State and Arizona. You can pretty much take what I said for the last game and replace the teams with these two. And pretty much describes what happened in this one. San Diego State moves on 79-70. Next up is Louisville and Yale. After starting slow, the Bulldogs would get hot and go up by as much as 12 and end the half up by 3. The Cardinals, try as they might, just could not come back. And Yale becomes the 5th double-digit seed into the Sweet 16, and they will be taking on the top seed in the South, Baylor. Next, we have Maryland and Auburn. In the first half, Maryland would go up, Auburn would come back, but the Terrapins would hold the lead. And the same story basically repeats itself in the second half, as Maryland propels themselves into the Sweet 16 by a score of 87-77. The final game of the second round would consist of Oregon and Butler in the West region. This was a different tale of two halves. The first half was close, going back and forth, and it ended with Butler up by 2. Once they were down 7, the Ducks turned on the Jets, and they would go up by as much as 11 with 20 seconds left and punch their ticket to the Sweet 16, and they would face Gonzaga. Now, the Sweet 16 presented a few surprises, a few favorites, and runs that are going to be remembered forever. On the Thursday of regional weekend, we have the Midwest region and the West region. The first semifinal of the Midwest region consisted of Creighton and Richmond. The first half saw both teams fighting tooth and nail, and it ended with the Blue Jays up 4. But out of nowhere, the Spiders would get hot and pull off another shocking upset on their way to the Elite Eight. The 11th-seeded Richmond Spiders are the first team into the round of 8. Next up, we have the first West Regional semifinal with Gonzaga and Oregon. The largest lead in the first half was 7, and it would end with a 2-point Ducks lead going into the half. Now, Oregon would go up by as much as 13, but the Bulldogs would claw their way back. But ultimately, it would be Oregon moving on to the Elite Eight, 92-87, as another number 1 seed goes down. The other Midwest semifinal would be a classic between the overall number 1 seeded Kansas and the 5-seeded BYU. The Cougars would be up by as much as 8 on the overall number 1, but Kansas would bring it to within 2 going into halftime. Both teams would have a big run, and in the last 2 minutes, 30 seconds, the Jayhawks did just enough to send themselves into the Elite Eight, 84-81. The other West semifinal had San Diego State and Maryland. The Aztecs' defense was on full display in the first half, holding the Terrapins to only 18 points. And the shooting got better in the second half for Maryland, but San Diego State got better overall, as the Aztecs would go on to the Elite Eight, 75-54. Then on Friday, we would have the South Regional semifinals and the East Regional semifinals. We're going to start off with the East, with those being Providence and Vermont. The Catamounts and Friars were close until the final 2 minutes and 30 seconds of the first half, as Providence would go on a 16-6 run, and it didn't get much better for Vermont, as their Cinderella run would come to an end by a score of 87-71, and the Friars are on their way to the Elite Eight. And while one Cinderella storybook closed, another continued with Baylor and Yale over in the South Regional semifinals. The Bulldogs went into halftime up 5 after a back-and-forth affair, and Baylor would come all the way back, but Yale would respond big time, 82-72 the final score. Yale taking out the number 1 seeded Baylor, and another curveball of curveballs in this 2020 NCAA tournament simulation. The other matchup in the East would be Seton Hall and Siena. The score could speak for itself. The Saints gave us a magical run, but they ran into a wall of Pirates. Seton Hall would send themselves into the Elite Eight with a final score of 100-62, and Seton Hall will take on Providence. The last ticket into the Elite Eight would be contested between Penn State and Arizona State, and the Sun Devils made the mistake of letting Penn State get hot in the first half. They could not escape the grip of the Nittany Lions, as Penn State would punch the last ticket 90-64. We've had a very wacky road on the way to the Elite Eight, but it's time to crown some regional champions, starting with the Midwest and then the West for our Saturday games. Kansas and Richmond would be your Midwest Regional Final. This was no normal 11th seed, and it showed in the first half as it went back and forth with the halftime score of 32-31, Richmond over Kansas. But soon the Jayhawks realized, we're the overall number 1, and they turned the talent on, and they would go to Atlanta 77-68. Oh dear, we're really going into some crazy matchups now. Now we have the West Final between San Diego State and Oregon. The Ducks would be up by as much as 9 in the first half, but the Aztecs would bounce back, and they would lead by 1 going into halftime. The second half would be back and forth, and it would ultimate into a chaotic final minute. Yanni Wetzel would hit both free throws to make it a 3-point lead with 3 seconds left, and Shakur Juiston put up the tying 3-point attempt, but it would not go, and San Diego State survives, and they will go to the Final Four by a score of 77-74. And now, the East Regional Final, consisting of Seton Hall and Providence. The game started back and forth, and then the Friars would go on to lead by 4 headed into halftime. And 4 would also be the largest lead in the second half, and the chaos comes to a head in the last minute. Nate Watson would tie the game with 42 seconds left. Miles Cale would put up the Pirates in front with a 3, only to be answered by A.J. Reeves. And with 2 seconds left, Miles Powell hits the 3, and Alpha Diallo would miss the game-tying 3, and Seton Hall would go on to the Final Four, 83-80 the final. The last ticket into Atlanta would be contested by Penn State and Yale. Penn State would not have any trouble at first, going up by as much as 17. However, you cannot trust any Ivy League schools to bend down. The Bulldogs would fight back and go into the half only down 5. The Nittany Lions would come out hungry for more and go up by 17 again, and Yale did not have enough time to come back as Penn State would punch their ticket to Atlanta 83-80, and we have your Final Four. And the 2020 Men's Final Four, according to this simulation, will consist of Kansas, Seton Hall, Penn State, and San Diego State. For Kansas, this is their 16th trip into the national semifinals. For Seton Hall, they were the runners-up in 1989, and that was their last Final Four appearance until then. Penn State, this is their first Final Four appearance since 1954. And for San Diego State, this is their Final Four debut. The first game would consist of Kansas and Seton Hall. The first half was both teams fighting tooth and nail, and we go into the half with a 5-point lead for Kansas. And since then, the overall number 1 seed would turn on the afterburners, and with a final score of 97-72, Kansas would be 1 win away from their 4th national championship. Of course, we're talking NCAA tournament championship. The other national semifinal will consist of San Diego State and Penn State. And it was all Aztecs in the first half, as they would show no remorse from the word go. It was a 17-point lead for San Diego State, and they would take their foot off their gas a smidge, but not enough to cost them a trip to their first national championship game, 74-64 the final. After a long while, we have finally reached the national championship. Kansas Jayhawks, San Diego State Aztecs. This was 2 teams that have been seen as some of the best throughout the 2020 NCAA season. Unfortunately, the pandemic would rob us of such glory, but guess what? We've just brought it back to life as if the pandemic never happened. It's time for the national championship and crown a champion. Will it be Kansas or will it be San Diego State? While Kansas had the lead for most of the first half, they could never pull away from San Diego State. The halftime score would be 34-32 in favor of the Jayhawks. The game would continue to be close, and the Aztecs were almost able to tie the game, but time ran out, and Kansas would win their 4th NCAA tournament championship, and it's their first national title since 2008. And of course, they would go on to win it in New Orleans in 2022, so this would have been 2 national championships in 3 seasons for Kansas. And that is going to do it from me. Huge congratulations to Kansas for winning the whole simulation. Whether Kansas wants to claim this national championship or not is to be determined. I highly doubt they're going to. But hey, now we can say with confidence that Kansas might have been the one to win the NCAA tournament that year, if not for Corona. But thank you guys so much for watching. I plan on releasing more What If series in the future. If you happen to see an interesting concept on the internet, let me know and I'll try to simulate that. Next one, I plan to do the NBA and NHL. What if they hadn't had to go into bubbles? What if this season were allowed to continue as planned? So that's going to do it from me. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what other what ifs you want to see. But until we meet again, I will see you guys in the next video. Take care, you guys.